Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? If so, please consider joining us in 2023 to become trained in the Neuroaffective Relational Model. The Level 1 online NARM Basics training is designed for helping professionals in a variety of fields, such as mental health professionals, substance abuse counselors, educators, doctors, nurses, other healthcare providers, coaches, and more. If you are a licensed mental health practitioner, you can join the Level 2 NARM Therapist training. This Level 2 training is a clinical training designed for licensed mental health professionals, current mental health graduate students, and active clinical interns and trainees, where you will get trained in a comprehensive developmental framework and clinical approach for resolving the long-term impacts of ACEs and CPTSD. For more information on these trainings and to apply, please visit narmtraining.com/schedule. We hope you will join us in 2023 for learning how to transform trauma. And now for our interview. Dr. Jim Coan is professor of psychology and director of the Virginia Affective Neuroscience Laboratory at the University of Virginia. Dr. Coan has worked with diverse groups, consulting for clinicians, businesses, and researchers. He is co-editor of the Handbook of Emotional Elicitation and Assessment and has authored more than 80 peer-reviewed articles. His work has been covered in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Time Magazine, The New Yorker, NPR, and several other major media outlets. Dr. Coan is a fellow of the Mind and Life Institute and produces the podcast Circle of Willis. Please enjoy this conversation with Dr. Jim Coan. Well, I'm sitting here with Dr. Jim Coan. Jim Coan, thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So I'd like to start, if it's okay with you, with a question that we ask all of our guests here on Transforming Trauma. And that is, what is it that you would like listeners to get from our time together today, from our conversation?
Probably the most important thing is that their brain assumes they should have access to other people who will help and support them. And that's part of why social support is so vital for health and well-being. I assume that listeners are either interested in treating trauma or have experienced trauma. Either way, don't discount the power of being around others who you love and trust. And I would take it even a step further, because many of us have heard that. Your brain will try very hard to convince you that going out to that office party is going to be just a slog and miserable. Don't listen. Go anyway.
Go anyway.
Go anyway.
That's great advice.
We now know in study after study after study, almost unequivocally, that you're a bad predictor of your future emotional feelings. And that's especially true when it comes to hanging around other people. When we're traumatized, we often think we need to sort of stay at home, tend to our wounds, and then we get lonely. Then we start holding people to impossibly high standards. Then we get lonelier, and so on. Every possibility, every probability, every likelihood is that when you go out to that office party you don't want to go to, you can have a pretty good time.
So go anyway. Don't trust the brain when it tells you don't go.
Right.
Awesome. I love that. I can't wait to dig into that. Already 3 questions are coming up for me about the research that you're involved with, but that's a great place to start. Okay. So tell us about the work that you're doing in the field of complex trauma. We'd love to hear.
Well, I don't study complex trauma specifically. What I study is it's really the sort of basic science of how the brain takes social relationships and transforms them into better health and well-being. That's what I do. We've known for many decades or millennia, depending on who you ask, that social relationships are associated with better health and well-being. But we've never really known why. We're sort of make a lot of assumptions. It's not a terrible thing to just say, well, we don't necessarily need to know why. We just need to know that.
Right.
But my lab is interested in trying to figure out why. And in that process, we have learned that the brain makes decisions about how our body will utilize, allocate, and budget its resources, even its metabolic resources, based on what we know about our social relationships. And that's almost like a first pass in how the brain decides to make those kinds of decisions. That's a lot.
It is a lot. I was just going to say that's really dense. Again,
Sorry.
Already I'm having like 3 questions. No, this is so great. This is so great. So you're not studying the field of complex trauma specifically, but you're talking about the brain and how, if you could distill it down into like one sentence, will you say that one more time for us?
Your brain does not treat your body as if you're the only one coping with a trauma when you know you have others there to help you. Think of your body as a miraculous vehicle for solving problems, right? It just can do so many things. Just your hands, right? They can do so many things. But a lot of problems are really hard to solve. There are a few problems more difficult to solve than complex trauma. And if your body is tasked with solving those problems all by itself, then it's going to weather, just like your house or your car. It's going to get run down. And yet, if your brain perceives that there's no one there to help you, then it's going to treat your body like your body is the only tool it has available.
Right.
And if it does that, you're going to suffer. You're going to feel more stressed. You're going to have more stress hormones in your body that dump more glucose into your bloodstream. You're going to be on high alert all the time. And so you're going to have more stress responses over and over and over again. When you know that you can outsource some of that emotion regulation, your brain doesn't make your body work as hard. Let's not talk about complex trauma necessarily. You go to a scary movie. And at the scary movie, you're like, I don't know about you, but I can't stand them. I just can't do it.
It's too much.
I can't even get on like the kids roller coaster. So if you're in a scary movie, you might, in an attempt to make yourself feel less scared, tell yourself a story about that movie that contradicts what you're seeing, right? I do this. So, I go to the scary movie and there's the actress like just getting a knife stuck into her body and it's horrible. And I go, she went to 6 years of acting school, studied Shakespeare.
Right.
Poor lady. She's now having to scream with ketchup being thrown all over her or something. And all of a sudden it's just like, it's a tragedy of an altogether different picture. And it has nothing to do with her being stabbed to death. And so I tell myself a different story. That's called self-regulation.
Okay.
And self-regulation is a wonderful tool, but it involves you using your own resources, your own prefrontal cortex to sort of clamp down your emotional responses. And it's hard. One of the things that we've learned is that at that same scary movie, you could reach over and clasp the hand of your special someone who's sitting there next to you, and your body will receive the benefit of emotion regulation without having to rev up your prefrontal cortex. And that is like a domino that causes all the dominoes effect to fall over throughout your body, where your body just isn't the tool that your brain is using to cope with the stressful situation of a scary movie. Your social environment is. You outsource. And so your body doesn't weather as much over a long time. In lots of instances, you get sick less often. you live longer, and the years that you add to your life are spent feeling better.
I have never thought of it this way. So it's like we're taxing our bodies a little heavier when we're not using this kind of social engagement piece.
Yeah.
That's fascinating. And it seems so obvious to me. And yet the way I'm hearing you talk about it is like really kind of the first time I've considered it like that. So I really appreciate that. So in the field of complex trauma, we can, listeners can obviously connect some dots and see how this is really important. So you're working with the brain. You're talking about how our brains communicate with our bodies and what that means in all of this. So, okay, tell us more.
The brain's job is to pay close attention to the demands and the affordances in our environment. Demand is just what it sounds like. It's, a challenge to what your goals are or your safety. And an affordance is something that you can get from the environment, something that you want that you could get. And so the brain's always monitoring that and making predictions about what your body will need to do in order to avoid the demand or cope with the demand and get the affordance. So this is kind of technical, but this is basically boiled down. This is what your brain does. This is what all brains at all levels, from the nematode to the human, this is what brains do. And what's different between us and the nematode is that basically the more brain you have, the more flexible your behavioral repertoire is. So humans can do all this stuff, including say to yourself, this is only a movie. No other critter can do that. Only humans. So your brain's always trying to make decisions about how to budget your body. How much are we going to invest your body in meeting a demand or gaining an affordance as something that you want? And that stuff is hard work. Imagine that you have to move a table, a dining room table, up 2 flights of stairs. Right? In a second, just for foreshadowing, I'll call that dining room table dealing with complex trauma. Imagine what you prepare yourself for when you think about moving that table up those stairs all by yourself. Now, you may not know this, but your brain will start before you do anything. It'll start dumping glucose into your bloodstream, pumping you with a little adrenaline. Maybe you're really dreading it, so you'll get some stress hormones that'll facilitate that whole process, suppress your immune system a little bit in order to extract resources from it. Your immune system is like a great big bank account. It's a huge store of energy in your body, and we can draw from it. Another example of how the brain is making predictions, like this table, when you stand up, you're sitting down right now. If you stood up right now, chances are good that you will not pass out.
Pretty good. I'm hoping.
Even though when you stand up, a whole bunch of blood is going to drop down because of gravity into your legs.
Yeah.
And that's going to take a little bit of blood away from your brain. And that's going to make you pass out from anoxia, lack of oxygen. The reason that doesn't happen is that outside of your awareness, just before you stand up, your brain changes your blood pressure. It increases your blood pressure a little bit by constricting your blood vessels, little tiny muscles in your blood vessels. And so when you stand up, there's a compensatory response that's already been enacted to make sure that your brain has all the blood and oxygen it needs, right? Okay, so.
That's pretty powerful.
It is. And this is happening outside of your awareness every minute of every day. Your brain is anticipating what your body needs and trying to make sure that those conditions are set before your body needs them. Okay? So now we're back to the table. You've got to lift that table up 2 flights of stairs all by yourself. You might even do it within conscious awareness. You might do some stretching. You might do a little aerobic warm up get your body ready. All of that, though, is an investment of resources, and your resources are limited. So if you're going to do all of that stuff, you're going to prepare, you're going to have to invest more of your own body's fuel. And that's got to come from someplace. The different systems of the body, turns out, grant each other short-term loans of energy because we can't hold enough energy for all of the systems in our body to do all the same things at the same time. This is why you should never exercise rigorously right after eating a big meal. Because if you eat a big meal, your digestive system needs a whole bunch of blood that would otherwise go to your muscles if you were exercising.
So that's the short-term loan you're talking about. Okay, got it.
That's the short-term loan. So if you exercise vigorously, you have to draw blood away from other systems because you don't have enough blood to do it all at once. And that's how we're designed. That's efficient. So imagine that you've got just one other person to lift that table up the stairs, 2 flights of stairs. Just one other person. You're going to be less likely to hurt your back. Your brain, outside of your awareness, will invest fewer of your own bodily resources in preparation for that. You'll avoid scuffing up the walls, and you might even avoid scuffing up the table. And it'll feel easier. In this example, coping with something like complex trauma is exactly analogous to that table.
Wow.
Your complex trauma is a table. You've got to lift 2 flights of stairs. And part of the reason that we have therapists that help people with complex trauma is that a lot of times people don't have that person or don't know how to ask that person for help, or the person that they do have doesn't know how to help lift up tables. So the therapist becomes the other table lifter. And what I like about that analogy is that it's even a metaphor, is that the therapist doesn't lift the whole table. That wouldn't work either.
Right. Is this your social baseline theory?
Yes.
Okay. That's what we've been talking about. That's what you've been explaining to us.
Social baseline theory is basically just the brain's assumption that there's going to be someone there to lift the table. The thing that we've discovered, to the extent that my lab has made an actual discovery, is that preparation to lift the table by yourself, the metaphorical table, that preparation is actually a stress response. Our body assumes, our brain assumes, by virtue of our animal nature, how we evolved, it assumes there's going to be someone there to help lift the table. And when there isn't, the brain sets off an alarm. So we mount a stress response from nothing more than the perception that we're alone. Hence the social baseline. Our baseline state is to be with other people. Now, there's some qualifiers, because one of the other things that we've learned in my lab is that other people can be a giant pain in the butt.
That's true.
Yes. And so what's also true is that being alone can feel sublime if you don't have to be.
Oh, if it's a choice, there's agency there.
If it's a choice, if there's an agency, if you get to choose to be alone, but you know that if you need help, you have access to it, that is a beautiful feeling. Because now you not only have the help you need, but you don't have to accommodate other people's pain in the butt.
Okay. I just had an image come up. I don't know if it's appropriate. So you can tell me if this tracks with what you're talking about here. But I even just had this image of like a toddler learning to walk or a baby learning to walk. And it's kind of like, this is a skill that we want to develop. We want to be able to walk on our own. as infants or babies. And so I just had this image of like the baby knowing mom was right there just in case.
That's exactly it.
Is that kind of what you're talking about? Okay.
Mm-hmm. The baby is able to become self-sufficient because it's dependent.
Because it's dependent. Okay.
So we have this false choice that our culture has sort of presented us in some weird way, that being dependent on others means you're not independent. But that's not how it works. Being dependent on others facilitates independence.
Being dependent on others facilitates independence. That's important.
Yeah, it doesn't even make sense the way I said it because we don't really have a way to describe it. My graduate students have sometimes said, what it really is being interdependent facilitates independence. And I think that's a better way to put it.
Yeah.
That people who are good at utilizing and contributing to and drawing from their social networks have more freedom to take risks.
Yes, that makes sense. There is more freedom to take risks when you know. Okay.
It's like having a safety net if you're on the trapeze.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So now I'm getting really curious about, so what brought you into this work? Like if we could rewind a little bit and go back to like what brought you into this field and this work that you're doing.
Many, many years ago, I started out studying relationships with John Gottman at the University of Washington. He's sort of become a kind of a marriage guru. But I got really interested in why some couples seemed to do really well, even though they fought. Everyone fights. If you're in a relationship, I already know that you fight. That was really clear. We looked at every kind of relationship you can imagine. Nobody got away with not fighting. But some couples did okay with that. In fact, in some instances, the fighting seemed to result in improvements, which is kind of what it's for.
Yeah,
if you
the
think
conflict.
about it.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's to work
Let's
it out.
try and fix this. Yeah. And in some couples it didn't. And it turned out that in the couples that did, there was this really interesting effect where even in the midst of a heated conversation, one or the other would make a joke or say something like, whatever it is, we'll get through this. I just really love you. We'll figure this out.
Some kind of bid for
Some
connection.
kind of bid for connection, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And what would happen, we were recording physiology in these folks the whole time. What would happen is that the other person's heart rate would immediately drop. And, any one instance of that is interesting. But what you have to keep in mind is that what we're observing in those studies is a single instance of something that happens all the time, day in and day out, often over years and years. And when you look at the aggregate effect, it's huge. This is why 4 years later, those were the couples that had better objectively measured health outcomes. They were less likely to get sick. They saw the doctor less often, etc. So fast forward, there's the drier part of my graduate training, which is straight up neurophysiology and neuroscience, just learning everything about the brain. Got to do that. And I got a clinical psychology degree at the University of Arizona. And on my clinical internship, I worked at the Tucson VA, and I had the tremendous privilege of working with war veterans who were experiencing really serious PTSD. In particular, the privilege of working with World War II era survivors of trauma who were suffering from late onset PTSD as they aged. So these were folks that were often completely blindsided by all of this because they had gone their entire adult lives without any symptoms. Then they get into their 70s or 80s, and all of a sudden, PTSD comes roaring in from stuff that happened 50 plus years ago. There was one client in particular who, his story is so horrible, I can't even begin to tell it. You know, I knew that World War II was rough, but I didn't really understand until working with these clients. And he couldn't engage with any kind of therapy that involved telling his story. He just wouldn't do it. I had trouble even getting him to do deep breathing. But he also couldn't sleep. He suffered terrible nightmares. He finally, one day, he goes, "Is it okay if I bring my wife in with me?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." She came in, and we had been starting to get to the point where I'm iterating, let's try and hear some of the story of what happened, to do a sort of Edna Foa-based intervention. And he just can't. He just freezes. And his wife reaches over and takes his hand. And when she clasps his hand, he begins to sob. And he cries and cries and cries. And in a few minutes, continuing to clasp her hand, he starts telling this horrific story, which she had never heard in 50 years of marriage.
Wow.
Because he was deeply ashamed of his own behavior in this war situation where he was involved in liberating a concentration camp. What I saw there was not as simple as emotion regulation. She wasn't making him feel better. If you were making a really simplistic analysis of it, she was making him feel worse, right? Because until she, exactly, until she held his hand, he was just numbed out. So the aha moment for me was to see that she was facilitating something that otherwise he felt literally powerless to do on his own. And I wanted to know what that was, because he was working harder with her there than he was without, in a very real metabolic sense. His brain, I now know, made the prediction that he could now, in a sense, afford to do the work I was asking him to do.
Oh, wow. She was helping him move the table.
She was helping him move the table. And so I did what anybody would do, and I designed an fMRI study to replicate it. And the fMRI study, and we've done dozens of these studies now, we have people go into the brain scanner and we put them under repeated threat of electric shock, which nobody likes. I've been shocked hundreds of times because I always test out the new procedure on myself.
Wow.
We have them do it alone or holding the hand of a trusted someone. We've done spouses, parents, good friends, cohabiting partners, dating partners. And what we find is that the brain invests fewer resources, metabolic resources, in the prefrontal cortex in particular when you're holding hands with someone under threat of shock. You devote fewer resources to threat vigilance. You don't feel the shock as much. We did a study of pain where we found that the hand-holding not only makes you feel less vigilant for the future instances of the threat cue associated with a shock, but that when pain actually arrives, you feel it less. And this is partly because pain is a signal to take action. Pain says, "Oh God, do something about this." And when you feel less pain, that's your brain saying, "Don't have as much to do." So I owe that couple, all the couples that I've worked with, so much. The couples that I worked with way back in the day, working with Gottman, who taught me about, managing each other emotionally, even during conflict. Couples that the World War II veteran who really supercharged my understanding of what was going on. That holding hands isn't just about soothing. It's about managing what your brain thinks your body can and should do. And sometimes it can allow your body to relax. And sometimes it can allow your body to invest more with the knowledge that you'll get the help you need later on down the road. That's why he was able to talk. That's the lifting the table. There's another great series of studies having to do with perception that comes into play here. It's both a nice metaphor and it's literally true, which is that one of the things about perception is if we have you stand at the bottom of a hill and estimate for us the steepness of that hill, you will, without any doubt, overestimate the steepness of the hill.
Really? That's fascinating.
Everybody does this.
Huh.
And so my colleague, Dennis Profit, has looked at why do people do this? Why? It's like a perceptual trick almost. And the answer, after many studies, is pretty unequivocally that all else being equal, your brain would rather you didn't walk up a hill.
So it's going to tell you it's steeper.
So it's like, that's pretty steep. Are you sure you want to do that?
But if you have a buddy with you, I'm curious, tell me what happens then.
So one of the things that Dennis Profit did, was he started having people, he wanted to see if it was really about the body's metabolic resources in response to a demand. So he had people put on a backpack that was roughly 30% of their body weight. And he had people randomly assigned to one condition or the other, and found that if you're a heavy backpack wearer, the hill is steeper systematically for everyone. If you run around the block 3 times first, if you fast, he found a correlation between body mass index and hill slant. And then shortly after I did my first hand-holding study, he did a study where he had people everyone was now wearing the backpack, but they were randomly assigned to either do it alone or standing next to their very best friend. And sure enough, the ones standing next to their very best friend had normal exaggerated hill slants, not heavy backpack exaggerated hill slants. In other words, it corrected to the point that they seemingly weren't even having a backpack on. This is the power of our relationships. Our relationships take our backpack off. They reduce the slant of the hills that we face in actual and metaphorical life.
I'm taking this in. I know I'm kind of quiet because I'm just taking all this in, and I have a very personal connection to this now. Something is making sense to me now in my own life as you're sharing this. A very literal example.
Do you want to share that?
Well, is it okay? I don't know.
Yes,
I'm just thinking about, okay, so I have a loved one who once a month, she's got to get a shot in her eye. And my youngest, now he's almost 4. But when this first started happening, my youngest was an infant. And so I would take this loved one to the doctor's appointment and I would drop her off because I had a little one and I couldn't take him in. But now that he's older, there's different. So sometimes he's with a sitter or he's with my husband. And so I've started going in with her and holding her hand. And that was my instinct as I'm sitting there watching the doctor and the nurse prep her eye. And I'm like, I can't not hold her hand right now. It felt so wrong for me to sit on this chair on the other side of the room. And so I started going and holding her hand. So I'm just feeling a little tender right now as I'm hearing you talk about this.
Has she give you any feedback about it?
This is what the doc that I just was connecting is she swears that this doctor must be doing it different because it doesn't hurt as much.
Yeah.
So I was like, that tracks.
I have consulted for a group of eye doctors in the UK who, they do various kinds of surgeries, but they were mostly doing that sort of LASIK stuff. And one of the things that they fear is movement. right? You need to stay very still while they're doing it, because movement is what really causes the problems to happen. And it just so happens that one of the circuits in the brain that we found goes a lot quieter when you're getting your hand held is a circuit that is responsible for tensing up your body. So in a series of email exchanges, one of these doctors said, we have this senior center like across the street. And what do you think? I was thinking about maybe asking if any of them would serve as volunteer handholders.
I love that.
I was like, yeah, man, give it a try. And they did. And they found a pretty sharp reduction in their movement-related complications. And that surprised even me, because these are strangers, right? These are not
even close friends.
Kindly, elderly folks who are delighted to come over and hold hands with somebody to try and help and be purposeful and have a job to do. And everybody seems to win in this situation. And, part of my work in this life is to educate people about how all of that's how we're supposed to be. That's how we evolved to operate. That's why we call it the social baseline theory. It's our baseline state is to be in this stuff. And we, I think, used to, and when I say used to, I'm talking 15,000 years ago, we used to be much better at this because we didn't have other options. We couldn't imagine other options. But now we have houses and cars and electric blankets and iPhones and the whole thing. And so, in a sense, we've given ourselves ways to afford not having other people around and helping us all the time. Because, like I said, again, other people are a pain in the butt. And they really are. I don't need to tell you this. Even your friend whose hand you hold is a pain in the butt sometimes. And what we knew in the olden days, now we can go as recently as maybe our grandparents, is that other people were an investment. You were investing yourself. One of the things that we've learned, and other people like James Gross at Stanford and other folks at other places have learned, is that people who are really good at self-regulating, telling themselves it's only a movie, they don't do it as often as people who are not so good at it.
When you say they don't do it, they don't do that for themselves as often as people who, oh, interesting.
Right. Yeah. Huh. And do you know why?
Oh, no. Why?
It's because people who are really good at self-regulating tend to use their self-regulation skills strategically in order to build relationships that are good. And then they let those relationships be like the cloud they float on for the rest of the time. So what that suggests to us is that a non-trivial amount, maybe all of it, the reason that we're so good in moments where we need to be good at self-regulation, it's for the purpose of constructing, maintaining, and repairing our relationships.
Wow. So in NARM, we talk about connection and disconnection and how you kind of have to have both, like the baby who's eye gazing with mom, but then has to break focus because it's too much. There's too much when there can be too much connection, right? So what I'm hearing you say is that the disconnection or the self, maybe not disconnection, but even self connection to the self instead of with others, that's really utilized to support and make better the connection with others. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
That's going to facilitate the connection.
Okay, that's going to facilitate the connection. Okay.
Because you're going to have more in the tank. So there's lots of other ways in which it manifests too. Sometimes the toddler is just being a giant pain in the ass and you are like, oh, that screaming thing. And you want to yell at it. You want to go like, stop it. And that would be bad for your connection.
Right.
And so your prefrontal cortex kicks in and says, you know what? Let's facilitate this connection. What do you need, sweetie? How can I help you? Come here. Give him a hug. And that moment of self-regulation makes the relationship better. Same thing with married couples. You know, you didn't take out the garbage again. And that's 2 weeks. We're backed up. What a mess. I'm so embarrassed about the front of the house. What are you, an idiot? No. Take a deep breath, regulate yourself. Sweetie, we need to have a conversation about the garbage because I'm really feeling stressed out about this. And we need another solution. Whatever's happening now isn't working. And that is a very different message from, what the hell's wrong with you? Are you an idiot?
Right.
Even though it might require a little more investment on your part. But that investment over the long term means you'll work even less hard than most because your relationship will carry you.
You're blowing my mind a little bit here. And I'm familiar with Gottman's work. Like, it's not that that's new, but like, this is a totally different way of framing it in my mind. That the idea of using my own inner resources and like connecting to the self and getting some solitude or whatever, however you think of it, that's actually facilitating a better connection with those around me. I mean, that's probably obvious to a lot of people, but it isn't to me. And so I appreciate the way that you're talking about this. To me, it just sounds like our connections with each other, with our fellow humans, that's like the oldest technology that's in existence.
Yeah. I tell my undergrad students, they're the original iPhone.
Yeah, exactly. I love it. That's so true. I love it. I'll tell my 15-year-old that.
There you go.
You are the original iPhone.
Yes.
That's cool. Wow. Well, I'm just really appreciating the work that you're doing even more. And I'm kind of, I think, just scratching the surface, just discovering more of what you've been doing. I've been looking up some of the exciting things that you have coming up. But before we go there, I just wondered if there's anything else that you would like to share with our listeners in terms of what you've discovered and as you've been doing this work and all of that good stuff that I know you still have.
Well, one of the things that's been really interesting about the pandemic is that we've had to so I started taking a lot of calls from journalists during the pandemic. They're like, well, okay, Mr. Smarty Pants handholder guy, what do we do now? We can't be around each other. And, I was like, I don't know. You tell me.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Am I supposed to solve this problem on my own?
Right. But I did start thinking a lot about it and researching a broader swath of human behavior all around the world, different cultures. What do people do when they're stressed out? And what I discovered sort of blew my mind. One of the things we could ask is, how do we forge a relationship that we know we can depend on? And if you drill down into the attachment literature, for example, or Sue Johnson, I did some work with her, or, even Bowlby's work, what you find is that there's this dynamic that you have with other people whereby you are vulnerable with them. You expose yourself to pain, potentially, to being mistreated or taken advantage of, and they treat you well. And then you reciprocate. This is how you teach your very jittery and finicky brain that someone else can be trusted. As you give them your neck and they don't bite. Right? And so the question started to become, well, how do we enact that? Obviously, touching is a huge act of vulnerability. Touching someone is like, what's going to happen? Especially if you're just falling in love or whatever it is. We've all experienced that crazy nervousness. Is this going to blow up in my face? Or is this going to be okay?
Yeah.
And when it's okay, it's like taking the best medicine ever for your brain. So how can we do that in other ways? Well, it turns out that in every culture on the planet where anyone has ever thought to ask, people dance together, people sing together, people do all of these things that are kind of vulnerable. And so I was on a call with a reporter from The New Yorker, who was a war correspondent, who was very lonely during the pandemic. She was supposed to be interviewing me, but I was like, how are you doing? Not well. And I thought, okay, Coan, I'm going to do it. And I sang this song to her that my little girl taught me. It goes, "Ah, poor bird, take thy flight high above the sorrow of this dark night." Very simple. And she started to cry. And we had a connection all of a sudden. I started asking my undergraduate students in my neuroscience classes to sing this to each other, which they were like, what? What is this? Why have you lost your mind? Is this a manic episode now? And I was like, no, there's a point to this. So they did. And then afterwards they'd be taking selfies together and, hugging and stuff. So one of the things that I would like to see more in the world is people singing to each other, writing love poems to each other, dancing with each other. And people say to me, well, what if I suck? What if I can't sing? And I tell them if they can't sing, they're so lucky, because that's going to make it even better, because you're more vulnerable and the person on the other end's heart is going to melt when you do that if you're not practiced. I mean, it'll happen even if you are practiced. Everything will be good. But it works because of the risk, not despite it.
That's so beautiful. In NARM, we talk about heartfulness. It's like this piece that what you're naming, it's like, that's like the healing, for me, at least in the work that I'm doing, that feels like the healing balm is the heartfulness piece of the connection. And that's what I'm hearing you say is like, when it's even that much more vulnerable, when you're not practiced, when you don't have a perfectly, smooth voice, it's a little bit more vulnerable. You're putting a little more on the table.
Yeah.
Risking a little more. And that makes it all the more beautiful, the connection. I love that. So you'd like to see more dancing and hear more singing?
Yeah, I would. Think about at the beginning of the pandemic in Bergamo, Italy, where they really experienced some of the brunt of the first of it. And people were being loaded into military storage trucks because so many people were dying. And you had people going out into their balconies and singing to each other. That's instructive. Now, if you're talking about dealing with trauma, all of the things we've talked about today in this brief time are just more so. Everything is even more important and more powerful, and you'll see effects that are stronger, because most of us who are not traumatized don't have as heavy a table to lift up the stairs. So it matters even more.
Wow. I'm going to be thinking about this for a while. I work with couples and more recently couples who have been through some kind of trauma or maybe even in their own relationship, maybe a betrayal or something. And I'm just thinking about, okay, how can this be kind of weaved into the work? I'm even thinking about the singing piece or dancing piece.
Keep me in the loop. I'd love to know.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I'm going to be thinking about this for a while. Well, thank you so much, Jim. Any other things that you'd like to share with us? No?
I think that's good. I don't know if we want to get into all the neuroscientific details of how we know all this stuff. Maybe so.
In the future and talk a little, dig in more to the science, but this has been beautiful. How can our listeners find you? How can they come in contact with your work? And we'll put some links in the show notes. Okay.
You can find me at jamescoan.com. You can find me at the psychology department's website at the University of Virginia. And you can hear me to the point where you're totally sick of me by listening to my podcast, which is called Circle of Willis, Willis. And that podcast is about the human stories behind the science that gets made for everybody.
Beautiful. Well, we will put links to those things in the show notes. And again, thank you so much for being here and for the work that you're doing in the world.
Thank you for doing this.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. Do you want to join the international NARM community in support of trauma-informed care? We are excited to be kicking off trainings in early 2023 designed to support those of you working with clients or populations dealing with the effects of adverse childhood experiences and complex trauma. For more information on these trainings and to apply, please visit narmtraining.com/schedule. We hope you will join us in 2023 for learning how to transform trauma. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.